But welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries, providing an opportunity for the audience to engage in real time. The webinar series is a platform for senior members to engage, debate, and collaborate on pressing issues of the day. And today we're going to have a presentation on architecture and the edges of public space, tools and strategies for a new urban agenda with Luisa Bravo, Peter Elmlund, Michael Mehaffy, and Dhiru Thadani. And you can register for a coming webinar. Next week, we've got a webinar on two major traditional neighborhood developments underway in Oklahoma, which is the state where we are having CNU 30 upcoming later this month. You can go to cnu.org/resources/on-the-park-bench. And I wanted to talk a little bit about CNU 30 in Oklahoma City, which will be March 23rd through 26th, 2022. And it's going to be CNU's first in-person Congress since 2019. It's very exciting. And we pretty much have the program finalized. We have a Congress app that you can download on the CNU website. You can go to cnu.org/connect to download that app, and we're still filling it out, but you can see you can see it as we fill it out, the program that's coming up. You can still register for CNU 30, and there are hotel rooms available. It is going to be a great opportunity to meet some of the best urbanists in the world who are going to be there, and check out Oklahoma City, which has done some amazing things with its commitment to urbanism in and around downtown. But first, join or renew your membership to CNU, become a current member, and save $200 off your CNU 30 registration. Check your membership status today at members.cnu.org/memberships. And today, as I said, that we're going to be talking about architecture and the edges of public space, tools and strategies for a new urban agenda. And the New Urban Agenda came out of the Habitat 3 conference that was adopted by all 193 countries of the United Nations. Its provisions closely parallel those of the Charter of the New Urbanism, particularly in the emphasis on a well-structured, walkable public realm. And joining us today are Luisa Bravo, who is an academic scholar, activist, urban designer, and social entrepreneur. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public Space, the first interdisciplinary academic open access journal entirely dedicated to public space. It was established by the City Space Architecture in 2015 in partnership with UN Habitat. Peter Elmlund is Director of Urban City Research and Future of Places at Axon Johnson Foundation and a board member of the International Making Cities Livable Conference. And joining us today with a recorded message is Michael Mehaffy, a development consultant, planner, designer, author, educator, researcher, and executive director of the International Making Cities Livable Conference, as well as executive director of the Oregon-based Cestasis Foundation. And Dhiru Thadani is an architect and urbanist based in Washington, D.C., winner of many charter awards from CNU. He is also an author, including two major books on Seaside, the latest Reflections on Seaside. I'm Rob Studeville, editor of CNU's Public Square. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about the CNU history. I don't usually do that with this audience, but we have quite a few international people today who haven't heard it. And this relates to the content today, but CNU was founded in 1993 by a group of architects in Alexandria, Virginia. They were working with developers and planners and public officials and others, but this was founded in response to this problem of sprawl in North America, the problem of cities being damaged by bad urban renewal and highways and development through these cities. Our metropolitan area is really spreading out in an automobile-oriented sprawl. And these architects had design solutions to the problem of sprawl. Other people had had public policy solutions and had other kinds of solutions, maybe partial design solutions, but this group had a comprehensive design approach to sprawl, and this was all written clearly in a charter of the New Urbanism, which was signed and adopted in 1996 in Charleston, South Carolina. The charter of the New Urbanism has 27 principles at scales from the street and the block and the building to the neighborhood to the region. And it has been actually quite influential internationally, and not just nationally, because the provisions of the Charter of the New Urbanism apply anywhere. They could apply in cities and towns around the world. And in fact, people were picking up on the Charter of the New Urbanism in all different countries around the globe right from the beginning. And when we started the Charter Awards in 2001, immediately we had international applicants who had applied the principles of the Charter of the New Urbanism and won awards. And we've had 71 international Charter Awards. So with that, I'm going to pass this along to Dhiru.
Okay. Thanks, Rob. Okay, can you see my full screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So as Rob mentioned, this is actually the first of hopefully many events on the park bench that deals with international new urbanism or international partners in new urbanism, because we find that many organizations have adopted the very same principles. The goals are the same, maybe how you get there is somewhat different, but we're all looking at issues of sprawl and the disinvestment in cities and the damage that has been done to cities by various infrastructure or poor architecture or the lack of understanding on how cities work. So it doesn't really matter how you get there. It could be, a motive of profit. It could be an environmental issue. It could be a health issue. It could just be plain old philanthropic. Somebody wants to donate money to improve the place that he or she grew up in. Or it could be to solve issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Or it could just be simply, the installation or the return to goodness, truth, and beauty. We really can't start a discussion on public spaces unless we look at this kind of enigmatic drawing by Leon Krier. It's iconic now. It was done about 40 years ago. And Leon essentially pointed out that the true city was built by two elements, a private realm and a public realm. And within the public realm, what we had was public buildings and associated public spaces. So public spaces and the public buildings belonged to everyone. And that was really the kind of essence that held a society together, was the fact that we had these public spaces where people could congregate, discuss, enjoy themselves, etc. After hearing that talk initially by Leon, I went back and tested this idea with my hometown, Bombay. And here's a map of the core, the colonial, I would call it the colonial core of Bombay. And the diagram on the right is all the public spaces with their corresponding public buildings that line, that front them. So it really made this idea of these two realms made a lot of sense to me, which then led to the notion that what we've been doing is really focusing in the last 60 years on the object. The building is the object. And the little plan on the upper left could be the plan of this building, which tries to put an entire city into a single building. Or the diagram on the upper right is a plan of Florence and this space. And you can see that both of them are very linear. In one case, it's white. In the case of Florence, a linear Uffizi gallery. And the idea is that the buildings there are irregular, but they contribute to making this figural space. And so I think this emphasis on the building as object has really taken us away from making wonderful public spaces. So a lot of us have been doing a lot of research on public spaces, and they mostly been plan drawings. And here's just a collection of public spaces from around the world that I've been documenting. There's hundreds more of these, and a lot of them are available, were printed in my book, The Language of Towns and Cities, so they're easily accessible. But here, predominantly we were looking at plan views, not like the traditional figure ground drawings. We did add green for the landscape and blue for the water, so the drawings were a little more clear in their definition. But we never really started to look at the edges of buildings. And I think the conference coming up in Paris is really important because it's actually now focusing on these edges. And those edges can be made by buildings, or they can be made by walls, as you see in the case of Piazza del Popolo on the axis, the cross axis, or it can be defined by landscape and the edges. So there's a lot to learn on how to make public spaces and the definition of these public spaces. Public spaces, like this very intimate space in France, which actually one of the entries is through this, through a building, a tunnel in a building. It's very well defined, but then it's also shaded by these magnificent trees. And you can see that 3 of the trees have been replaced. The one on the right is one of the original trees. So there was care enough to, to kind of replant the trees to kind of recreate the space as it was originally intended. And here there's another example of a small, extremely well-defined space in Paris. But again, the kind of central feature here is the landscape, these 4 large trees. And again, 3 have been planted more recently. 1 is the original. So I want to take this one step further in this idea of the edges. I think we've looked at all these spaces without actually trying to develop some hierarchy or some grouping or some method of actually analyzing these spaces. So what I've done as my first stab at this is that along the top row, I'm trying to define 5 different types of public spaces. One which is closed, where the walls are extremely well defined. The second is a public space, in the case of University of Virginia, which is dominated by a central figure, and in that case, a library, or a kind of a nuclear space where, like the US Capitol, which has all these auxiliary gardens going off from it. Or the 4th condition is where they group, as in the case of Savannah, where there's a kind of rhythm to how these parks occur within the city plan, both north-south and east-west. It's also true in Washington, D.C. Along K Street. We have a series of parks that kind of show up every 2 blocks. You get 2 blocks of buildings, 1 block of park. So that's the kind of grouping of parks. And then finally, the amorphous open space, which really a lot of times does have nothing to do with the shape or the name. In this case, what I'm showing is Harvard Square. And really there is no square there. It's essentially a traffic intersection. Then in the other column, I've listed residential uses. Now, spaces don't have to fall clearly in one or two of these. They can fall in multiple categories in here. So a building can be both residential and have retail. I mean, a space could be both residential or retail, or civic and monumental. Things can occur. So this is just the first stab at trying to organize these, and it's the kind of, for me, the inroad to start to look at the elevations of buildings of that front these public spaces, and then try to kind of categorize those, so we start to understand what kind of architecture is appropriate for the use and the kind of space that we're trying to make. So this is just the first stab at this. As I said, it's not a clear, it's not totally, cooked, but it's a way to just start grouping these public spaces that I've been documenting. And finally, I just want to reinforce what Rob Studable said about the New Urban Agenda. If you read the New Urban Agenda, and others will talk about it in this webinar, it's really broken down into 4 categories, exactly the same 4 categories that New Urbanism has been involved in: economic, environmental, spatial, and social. And that really is the framework for the New Urban Agenda. So with that, I'm going to stop and put Michael's video on.
Greetings, everybody, and I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in real time, but I did want to leave some grist for the mill for this conversation, which I'm looking forward to viewing later online. And in the meantime, I hope to see many of you in Oklahoma City or maybe in Paris. So the title of this webinar is drawn from our upcoming conference in Paris of the International Making Cities Livable. We're doing it this year in partnership with the Congress for the New Urbanism. This year, our theme is Architecture and the Edges of Public Space, Tools and Strategies for a New Urban Agenda. So it's really thinking differently about the way architecture has a job to do, really, in framing public space and creating the edges of public space and supporting all of the benefits that we get from public space: social interaction, walkability, exercise, more ecological lifestyles, all the other things that we get from a more walkable mixed-use city or town or suburb. So that's what we're going to be talking about at the conference. And by the way, you can go online to imcl.online, and you'll see a lot more information about the conference, including this little video tour that I did of the venue, which is a really fantastic suburban retrofit exemplar of an old Paris banlieue that has been retrofitted into a much more walkable, mixed, diverse kind of neighborhood, and really fascinating case study. Actually, this is the main venue. We'll be meeting and having a fantastic opportunity to explore what they've done, not only here, but in the Paris region in general. Some of the lessons of the 15-minute city and the livability interventions that they're doing there, and also some of the other challenges that they are confronting, that we're all confronting, affordability and equity, and other challenges of more ecological, more resilient, more livable human habitat. So we look forward to a fantastic conference, and we hope to see you here. So what are the tools? What are the strategies that we can share with each other? That's what we're going to talk about in the conference, bringing people from the United States, from Europe, from around the world to bring their expertise, bring some of the best practices, some of the research expertise, and examine the lessons for this moment in history. This is a very interesting moment, in part because we have an international agreement now known as the New Urban Agenda, and 193 countries adopted this document by acclamation. So this is a landmark in urban history, really. And many new urbanists don't realize that actually the New Urban Agenda embodies many of the principles of the Charter of the New Urbanism, as the research from my colleague Tigran Hass and I have shown. In fact, if you go through the 2 documents as we have done, you can see 6 different points of agreement between the Charter of the New Urbanism and the New Urban Agenda, and in fact, complete disagreement with the much earlier Athens Charter of 1933 on the zoning of urban elements, on street design, on the orientation of buildings, on treatment of historic structures and patterns, on the role of specialists in relation to citizens and citizen involvement, and on the accommodation of change and flexibility over time. By the way, I talk about this in a little more detail in the Public Square article that I believe is running right now, if you're interested in that. But the upshot is that I think we have a historical moment right now where new urbanism, by whatever name, has been very, very influential all around the world. But the big challenge now, of course, is implementation. How do we take this forward? How do we achieve success in implementation at a larger scale? And I think we all need to work together on that challenge and share our case lessons, which is exactly what we're going to be doing in Paris and in other places around the country and around the world. And yes, to work locally, to focus on local implementation, but to learn from each other internationally, you know, to coin a phrase, to think globally and act locally. And I think that's what we've got to do. So I look forward to seeing many of you there.
Thank you, Michael. Luisa, you're on.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you for this invitation. I'm now speaking from Italy, and this is exactly in line with what Michael was mentioning, that we need to cooperate internationally to develop meaningful contents related to public space. I've been into, just some background information, I've been into public space research for quite a long time. I'm an academic scholar. I've been working in Italy, but also abroad. And I'm currently a adjunct professor in urban design at the University of Florence. So I approached the public space from a research and academic perspective, first during my postdoc. But then at some point I realized that I needed to expand activities also related to research on public space by being more attached to the ground and to what actually was happening in public space. And so I established the non-profit organization City Space Architecture in 2013. And I started to develop this community of public space researchers, professionals, community organizations, artists, and activists. And through City Space Architecture in 2015, I established the Journal of Public Space in cooperation with the UN Habitat. The first issue of the journal was launched at the Habitat 3 conference in Quito, where also the new urban agenda was adopted. And so the Journal of Public Space is part of the implementation activities related to the new urban agenda. And the approach to public space from a journal perspective is not just about academic research, but it is also about design solutions and opportunities for public space to expand the huge potential that it is embedded in a lot of different, spaces, pocket spaces, gardens, streets, in the historic center, but especially in the suburban developments. So I don't have a PowerPoint presentation because I prefer to share with you the website of the Journal of Public Space for those of you that do not know the journal. I have to mention that the way the journal has been established, you can go online, journalpublicspace.org, is actually resembling how a public space should be. So the Journal of Public Space is an open access, academic, interdisciplinary journal. So you can read and download all contents for free. We also do not apply article processing charges. So authors are publishing without paying. So the idea is that nobody is paying for publishing and for reading. So the Journal of Public Space is setting a model, a way of behaving that is resembling public space. Since we started, as I said, in 2016, we have already published a number of issues. If you go on archives, you can see that we have really worked hard in the past 6 years. Now the journal actually is collecting a lot of contents. As you can see, we have thematic issues. For example, we have a thematic series on art and activism in public space. We have special issues on specific topics. We have published 2 issues on Arab cities and Arab urbanism, and we are currently working to develop a special issue on African public spaces. We are also cooperating with international organizations for the development of the journal. I have to thank KTH, Royal Institute of Technology, and the Center for the Future of Places, because they supported us since the very beginning. And now the journal is also supported by RMIT University in Australia and the School of Architecture of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And during the pandemic, we got a very generous donation by the Robert Bosch Foundation in Germany. Since we do not get any revenues from the journal, actually this is a really very challenging project, and I'm just now scrolling down to show you all the different issues that we already published. So it's very challenging activity, and since we want to set the standard on a very high quality, we need to engage really very good peer reviewers, and we make a very careful selection of contents that we want to publish, because we are receiving many requests. We have the online submissions that are ongoing throughout the years, and it's really so enriching to see so much work around public space, but at the same time we have to make you know, some selections. The journal is really an instrument to promote the contents in the new urban agenda related to public space. You know that public space is clearly identified in several paragraphs of the Journal of Public Space, and has also a specific target and indicator. So the objective is very clear. But surprisingly, the effort around the public space is big, because public space as a cross-disciplinary topic is not completely and fully established. And so it is mostly part of some other major disciplines like architectural design, urban design, landscape design, but doesn't exist with its own, let's say, identity as a topic. And so efforts in terms of establishing knowledge around public space is really very difficult. And the reason why I established the journal is that in 2014, I started to search regarding you know, other journals that were publishing articles on public space, and I was surprised that at that time there was no journal that was clearly focusing on public space. And so this is the reason why we established the Journal of Public Space, which is still the first first ever journal entirely dedicated to public space. But as I said, the challenge is big. And so we are now working on several other projects that are supposed to work together with the Journal of Public Space. So for example, we are now developing this web magazine, which is Mastering Public Space. This is aggregation of contents related to public space that are already available on the internet from reliable and quality sources. So what we are doing is that we are creating, like a journal, which is non-academic, which is about, general readings related to public space, divided in different sections. And because I think 5 minutes are gone already, we are also starting this brand new project, which is the Public Space Academy, that has been funded now in January, so recently, by the Ove Arup Foundation. And if you come to visit us in Italy, in Bologna, you can come to visit us at the Public Space Museum, where I'm sitting now. So hope to see you soon in Italy.
Hello there. I'm the final one. First of all, I would like to mention that while Dhiru is not a genius when computers, he has other talents. I have seen him draw on a napkin at cafe upside down in front of my eyes, and I can assure you that Dhiru is a true genius. I'm Peter Elmlund from Axon Johnson Foundation. I have been running the Urban City Research Project for 20 years. I'm quitting at the end of April. But I was, from the beginning, a convinced new urbanist. And I actually introduced new urbanism to Sweden, 2002. And in the beginning, it was well received, but after a while, I was heavily criticized by many, in the morning press and everywhere, by architects and educators. So I stopped using the term new urbanism, but I have been working for the term during these 20 years. And I have been funding research and education at different scales, the micro scale, which is public space, and the meso scale, which of course is master planning. Among other projects, I have funded the Strathclyde University's morphological studies project, which is very exciting. But also at the macro scale, economists don't really understand the city structure. For them, a city is just geography and agglomeration, density, such things. But I have been trying to influence some important economists. So we have a collaboration with OECD about small firms and urban fabric. And we have a final conference in Trento in the end of April, where we mix macroeconomists with urbanists. And I think you can apply for that conference. I think it's open for everyone. We also have been funding education. One of the biggest projects in that regard is the Master in Sustainable Urban Design, as we call it. And we have examinated about 350 students, and the first guest professor was, by the way, Ellen Dunham-Jones, a very famous new urbanist. So yeah, in Europe, the term has been tricky. Our most successful project was the Future of Places project that we did in collaboration with UN Habitat and Project for Public Spaces in New York. And we gathered about 1,500 people from more than 700 organizations, 275 cities and 100 countries. And the purpose was to change the focus from objects to places in city building. And our key messages was influencing heavily the writings in the New Urban Agenda and in the SDG 11.7. It was more or less copied. So it was a very successful project, but of course, if you collaborate with UN Habitat, who was organizing the Habitat 3 event, it's easier. But also the strong representational power we had was important here. So the start of the future of places was actually a lunch at Union Square, Manhattan, 2012, with Fred Kent and his companion, Katie Madden, and the director for UN Habitat, Cecilia Martinez. And we were discussing that we needed a shortcut, another type of language to convince policymakers, mayors, investors, all these non-urbanist people who decide about cities. And during that lunch, we found out that we should work for shifting the perspective from objects to places. So if you look at this picture here, this image of Paris, for most people, this is a part of a city. But if you can look at this part more closely, you see that this is not really urban. It's very dense, but basically suburban in its structure. The building doesn't really define public space. You have no visitors behind the buildings. You have no diversity. So basically the city dies here. But of course here you have very lively streets and squares and everything. But how do you explain such thing for people who are not educated architects or urbanists? That was the discussion we had at that time. And it's still a very valuable discussion. So I think also when we are describing city planning, our imagery should start with places. What kind of places do we want? And the architecture should support those places. So whenever I'm involved in any kind of city planning projects, I always start with that. We need to start talk with the places first, architecture after that. And then we'll find out that all these disciplines, all these silos among city planning within a city, when we address the issue of public space, they sort of go out of their professional role and talks like citizens, because there are no really manuals for creating public spaces in the city's bureaucracy. So that's a very good start. So let me just finish with how you can talk about places from the other perspective. So this is the space that can be defined by architecture. Different types of architecture, of course, with different specifics, different morphology, different plot structure. So I would like to see more and more of this kind of imagery when you start with the places and then add the architecture. And in the long run, the architects will need to adapt to this perspective. So it can be very, very influential in the long run. Thank you. Is Rob coming in here?
No, Peter, if you could stop sharing.
Yeah. I will.
Okay, so far, unfortunately, we do not have any questions in the Q&A. So, Peter, I mean, those are an interesting set of diagrams. And how far are you taking that, or is that what the conference is about?
Yeah, it's a part of the conference. The IMCL conference is a little bit different from the typical CNU conference because it's much broader.
Mm-hmm.
We always try to connect urban design with something: economy, sociology, environmental psychology, etc., etc. We never talk about urban design in itself. And I think everyone should always try to connect it to some kind of outcome. So I can, since we have time, I can continue a little bit.
Okay, well,
if you want to.
We do have a question. Can you put up a link to the conference? Someone asked.
Now we can do that.
Okay. Or we can post it on the.
Put that into the chat.
We can put that into the chat. That might be easier. Everyone can see that. One question is really for both of you is what are the kind of main reasons against new urbanism in Europe?
Yeah, of course, there was the connection to perceived style preference. The charter doesn't say anything about style, it just says we should accept pluralism. But since many projects that were built in America were traditionally in their style, that was really controversial in the beginning of this millennia. It's easier now, but let's say 2002, 2005, 6, 7, it was really controversial. And I think one issue we have here is that many architects see the symbolic value of architecture, while ordinary people have another type of perception, that they have a more they see it practical. What can I do here? Is it nice here? Is it diverse, interesting? They don't think symbolically like many architects do. You know, is this the future, or is this progressive, or whatever they have in mind? So we have different perception about places in architecture.
Also, why the architects in the U.S. have not embraced new urbanism, because they see it as retro. Luisa, what about you?
Yes, I would like to add something to this question, the issues against the new urbanism in Europe. Since I was into actually new urbanism when I was a student during the 90s in Italy, and I remember that we discussed at that time implementation of the project in Plessis Robinson, where you will have the conference in May this year. And there was an exhibition in a beautiful monumental building in the center of Bologna, presenting that project. And I was a student. I was with my professor, visiting the exhibition and understanding, the meaning of new urbanism. And it was very logic, and coherent for me as a student. But then I realized that professionals, architects, and also, local public officers didn't really give the same meaning to that intervention because of the tradition that Peter was also mentioning. In Italy, in Europe, we have certain values related to history and tradition. And so replicating those values in contemporary times was a kind of, disturbing, let's say. And also creating a lot of confusion regarding, the legacy of history. So that was understood as an attempt to replace history with something that was resembling history but was contemporary. And so I think this kind of concepts are still in place in Italy, and that's why there was huge criticism. And in fact, I remember when I was a student again, there were so many things happening around the new urbanism. We had a big conference in Bologna with Leon Krier against Riccardo Bofill, who at the time designed a new project for the railway station by having a very, very tall tower, much taller than the leaning towers that we have in Bologna. And so this was, there was a big reaction from the public opinion, because they were really against this idea of a tower so tall, close to very horizontal neighborhoods. And so Leon Krier was the opponent, and there was an event that really is very much impressed in my memories, where there was this comparison between new urbanism values and contemporary values. And so it was really enriching experience, but still, those ideas are struggling to be fully understood in Europe.
Yeah, I think one of the misunderstandings is that new urbanism promotes traditional architecture. It doesn't. If anyone reads the charter, new urbanism is really agnostic to any style. All styles can make great urbanism, but it is really the marketplace that has determined the preference of style. So most of the projects, at least in the US, are a response to the marketplace versus really the new urbanism dictating tradition or traditional architecture. There's clearly a disconnect, as you say, Peter, between what people want and what's being delivered by the architectural profession. There is a question here, I want to go on to about winterizing. How do these spaces work in winter? I'll start because I know that from Jan Gehl's work, he tells me that, Jan Gehl says that there's a little bit of Italian in everybody. And at least in places like Copenhagen, they now use blankets, electric blankets, while they still sit outside at the restaurants and the cafes give out electric blankets. And I've actually experienced that myself, sitting outside with an electric blanket when the weather was cold. But that doesn't stop you from the rain and the snow. But do you have any ideas about or conditions that you've seen that make spaces habitable in the winter? No? How are these spaces used in the wintertime? Is there,
Well, if you talk about winter public spaces in Italy, I think we have this practice to stay outside because we are mostly a Mediterranean country. So even if it's cold, there is always, in Bologna, there is a very big square at the center of the city, Piazza Maggiore, which is one of the biggest squares in Bologna. And, you always see people crossing the square, on a diagonal trajectory, even if there are porticos, so almost all around the square, because, there is a kind of attraction to stay outside and leave the atmosphere, because public space is also about, senses, feelings. And so this is also part of the human experience in public space.
And people are also rediscovering the value of urban qualities. So up here in the north, the life here has changed enormously the last 20 years. People are spending much more time outside, outdoors during winter time. So
yeah, I think that'll be a slow process in America because people are not used to, people want to be inside if the weather is bad. So it's not, I think that's personal comfort seems to override, the need to be outside. But it is true. I think Bologna is lucky because of, whatever 20, 30, 50 kilometers of arcades allow you to, allow the restaurants to spill out into the arcades and also make it very comfortable to walk around when it's either very hot or when it's the weather's bad. But not all cities are that fortunate.
Yes. Yes, my hometown doesn't have so many, kilometers of porticos, but still, when I was a very young student, I was used to go to the main square. And actually, I have a nice story because when Jangel came to Italy to study public space, he actually visited and stayed several days in my hometown, which is part of life between buildings, investigations, and also the latest how to study public life. And so that's the inspiration that is coming from my hometown that was good for Jangel and that's been good also for myself. The idea that you can actually enjoy public space because that was also the way I was living the city center in my hometown, going to the main square without even having scheduled any meeting, but just for the sake of enjoying, public space. And then I was sure to meet someone, friends, relatives, parents, because everything was happening in that main square.
So one of the things, we always talk about Paris, and you mentioned Paris, Peter, and it has a population of 22,000 people per square kilometer, one of the pretty dense by any standards. And but when you start to look at the Parisian house, even within the city, it is really quite small. The actual house itself, the spaces that you occupy. I mean, of course, there are exceptions, but generally, the units are extremely small, and that forces, I think, in a way, the need for public spaces, that you have these lungs, the places that you can go out and enjoy. And I think going into the future, as we start making smaller and smaller places, the need for public space is going to increase even more. Because
you're referring to the plot structure, Dhiru. Yes.
Sorry?
You're referring to the plot structure.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we are at an hour point. I don't know if you want to answer one more question or and then bring it to a close.
There's a lot of conversation on the chat, but not in the Q&A for some reason. And some of the comments in the chat are quite long. So it's difficult to really pull out a question from those.
Yes, I see a lot of comments actually.
Yes. Method calls. Oh,
we got a question here about space syntax. Do you see that?
Yes, there's a question about space syntax. And actually, a lot of folks have actually talked about that within New Urbanism. There's been several folks from England who have been part of New Urbanism and have brought those ideas and that conversation at the various congresses. So,
it's a very good analytical tool, that's for sure. Maybe not so convincing for ordinary people, but for an urbanist, architect, traffic engineer maybe. But I think its strongest value is in the suburbs. If you look at the traditional part of the grid, you understand when you see it, how the flows will go. It's much more difficult to understand the flows in the suburbs.
Right.
And there I find space syntax really valuable. To figure out where to do something. Where should I create, let's say, Main Street in the suburban desert, for example?
So, Rob, I mean, we could continue for a few more minutes. And I know that this will be posted, so people who want to, leave at 1 o'clock or or it's already past 1, can do
Well,
so.
it
And
depends on Peter. Can you continue, or can you?
yeah, that's
You have
right.
to. Do you have to sign off right now?
I didn't get it.
Can you continue for a few more minutes, or do you have to sign off?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so Peter, you was talking about the value of space and tax in the suburbs, and not so much in the city.
Yeah, for me, it's more valuable as an instrument, analyzing the suburbs, especially European, quite dense suburbs.
I see. Okay.
Yes, I agree, because in the suburbs we have a completely different environment from the consolidated historic city. And so the analysis is on flows and dynamics rather than on spaces. Actually, you can understand how to put a new public space or to adapt an existing public space according to the flows and dynamics that are happening in a certain area or in a certain neighborhood. So instead of maybe designing in a traditional way, let's say, you can actually readapt, reuse, redesign even small parts, or maybe but just adding urban furniture to create some livable opportunities for public space. So for example, the place where I'm here now, the Public Space Museum, was a neighborhood supermarket. And so I completely renovated this space. Now it's a cultural space, but we are in the suburb. Well, it's, you know, Bologna is a very small city. So when I say suburb, it means 15, 20 minutes walk distance from the main square in the city center. But still, you know, the environment is completely different. So also the way people understand, live, and perceive public space is very, very, very different from what they understand when they are in the historic city. And there is this kind of mental attachment to the main square in the city center, because that is what they understand as a public space, rather than, you know, the street or the small park near their apartment. So this is superimposition coming from history, especially in Italy and European cities in general that have this very strong legacy of the past, is a kind of influencing, you know, the way people, common people, live public space in the suburb. They don't even know that they are living in a public space, because definition of public space in suburbs is really blurred and not fully understood.
There's an interesting question about formal versus informal public spaces, and the best places to place and use public space. You know, the formal and the informal. How do you decide that? There's a whole spectrum. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, it's you know, very related to what I was explaining now, because, you know, in even as Dhiru was showing, even when we see a map of a city center, we clearly understand the network of public spaces. But then when we compare the map of the urban form of the city center with the same map and urban form of the suburb, you know, public space is disappearing, because it is not shaped according to the same principles that were used for the city center. And so then someone could say, well, so public space doesn't exist in the same way it was conceived and designed for the city center, but it actually exists in a completely different way that is made also of informal opportunities. And so this is the richness, I believe, of suburban public spaces, because it is always constantly different and with so many opportunities of adaptation, reinvention, also some temporary, opportunities for public space and public life that are not supposed to be long-lasting and forever public space as we have, in the city center.
You're much more optimistic of a suburban public space than I am, because I really think public space is being defined. It doesn't have to be regular, but as you said, a lot of cities have a small, especially the Italian towns, small towns, have a public space that's the stabilizer, as Colin Rowe would refer to it. It's a clean form that everyone can relate to, and then you measure things off from that stabilizer, that particular open space, and that happens. Washington has all these intersections and public spaces, which really are more than traffic, and that's one of my categories. But all the addresses, they make addresses within the city, and then everything is measured off those addresses. So you say I'm 3 blocks from DuPont Circle, east or whatever. And that's, I think, the importance of those public spaces, because their contribution as addresses. But you also have, as you said, amorphous spaces that aren't traditional in that sense, and they could just be equally exciting spaces.
Yes. Yes.
So absolutely, I think the city.
I would say the most important urban design element for public spaces is what you mentioned. It's the plot structure.
Mm-hmm.
You can do a lot of different types of architecture if you have this fine-grained mix of buildings. If you allow me to share 3 minutes, I can show you some entertaining example.
Okay.
About plot structure. I am sharing now, yes?
Yes.
Yep.
But I have no response from the. Do you see this?
Yes.
So this is one of the most important streets in Stockholm, Hornsgatan, extremely complex. A lot of small firms, a lot of bigger firms, and a nice flow. People live here, people work here, it's everything. It was threatened in the 60s, and the politicians want to turn it down and replace it with this, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Where you have one building on the block, basically. It never happened there, but it happened at other parts of Stockholm. The current pattern where we build blocks in Stockholm today is about 2 buildings on the block. It doesn't really make an urban fabric.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe 4 or 5 on the block start to create something. And maybe in 20 years from now, we will be able to arrange the plots like this, and you will have a livable Main Street again. And the result of going from the patterns of the 60s to the traditional pattern, now, if you do it on a large scale, they will be enormous. The impact on the city will be enormous.
Yes.
And you can easily mix different groups in the block. You can have different types of houses, different types of price levels. You'll have more entrances on the street. Easier to encourage premises at street level because the individual building is not so big economic challenge. Yeah. And you can have a great variation of architecture, as I said, et cetera, et cetera.
I think, this is something we talk a lot about in the urbanist conversation about incremental growth. And, those days it's almost impossible now to have incremental growth. I mean, developers are always packaging up lots to do large buildings. And I'd like to say that a city can survive several small, ugly buildings. It can't survive a large, ugly building, because that totally devastates the block when you've got this very banal facade like you were showing. Maybe the only solution to help that is landscape, trees hiding the building. But I think those days, unfortunately, the economics today, and the people who are developing in very large quantities under the guise of efficiency, that it's efficient to build. Like in China, if you don't build the same floor plan for 2 million square feet or 10 million square feet, they think it's inefficient. Because every bathroom is the same, everything is the same between the units. And I think there's a false economy there, because what you actually then produce is something that's really unlivable, unlikable, unlovable, because it's so monotonous. And it'd be great if you could find a way economically to return to building small and incrementally. And, I'm not sure how you do that, Peter. Maybe some of your folks, but mostly all the developers that we deal with really want to aggregate lots as much as possible and build the largest thing. And unfortunately, when the economy collapses, you're left with this gigantic unfinished monster sitting in the city, or it's vacant. So I don't know, Peter, you got any thoughts about the economics of building small?
It is not that expensive as you might think.
Okay.
I have worked with some big building companies in Sweden, and we have been calculating back and forth. It's absolutely possible to build fine-grained structure.
Okay. Any examples?
The trick is that one builder is doing the whole block.
Right.
So you can have efficient production of it.
Right. But what about one architect? The trouble here is that
if you have subdivided the block into different pieces, you can have different architecture.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you have the same structure around the block,
okay,
the basic structure, then you can have a different type of architecture at the front.
I think
if you want to do it on a large scale, yeah.
I think that's works in theory, but I think when you come in front of the development community, they bargain the price with one architect, and that's the other part, that the fee gets much lower when you're dealing with one entity versus dealing with multiple entities.
You also see examples in Germany of this, where they allow people to build their own multifamily houses on the block. You have seen those maybe.
Yes.
They're quite fine-grained structures. Have you been in Tübingen, for example, outside Freiburg?
Mm-hmm. That's a policy that's it's really more a policy from top down that permits that or makes that possible.
Yeah.
We're getting some interesting questions about, I think, sort of modern society. Bob Haley from upstate New York also notes that the public realm has been evolved traditionally from the growth of the village, and is it being attached from the evolving private urban lives? We have another question about the importance of public spaces in the digital realm. I think they're related. Can you all talk a little bit about that?
Well, I would like to personally not have any digital in public spaces. The whole point of the public space is interaction with other people. And what you find today is a lot of people sitting in public spaces, looking at their cell phone. I think we've lost that one-on-one communication, like what we're doing now.
I think it's very common that people talk about public space as something related to democracy or something like that, going back to the Greek antiques and so. But the opposite of public space is private space, or maybe I would say private behavior. You have the bathroom behavior, the drawing room behavior, the garden behavior. It's a sequence of different behaviors. And out there you have public behaviors. And they can happen also in the authoritarian country. They also have public behaviors. It's not related to democracy or free speech or something like that. It's about behaviors, different degrees of publicness or privateness. Can you say so in English? But what? Whatever.
Well,
yes, if I can add, this concept of publicness is very important. And also going back to what you were discussing before related to economy. You know, in Italy, we have been into a lot of austerity measures. I mean, the south of Europe went into a lot of restrictions, economic restrictions. And in general, I would say that in Italy, there is a certain investment in public space in the city center, because also politicians and public officers understand the value of public space in the city center, also because it produces tourism and economic revenues. But they do not understand why it is important to invest also in suburban areas for public space development. Investment, it means investment in terms of design, investment in terms of financial resources. And so also the way, you know, the city center is approached and suburban areas are approached is different from those that from top down are supposed to develop policies, implementation and actions. So in the suburban developments, that the publicness is coming without any economic support somehow. And it is mostly based on community efforts and bottom-up temporary activities that are really a mirror of the suburban society, I would say. So that's why it is very interesting to study, you know, suburban areas and to understand how such public dynamics that are really much linked also to private behaviors, as Peter was saying, are intertwined and are, you know, informing way of life, a way of urbanism, you know, in a certain way.
I think I will thank everybody for being part of this, and thank you, Peter, Luisa, Dhiru, and Michael, who is not present, but contributed, and all of the people who participated and watched this. We thank you very much for this, and I look forward to seeing people in Oklahoma City and perhaps meeting up. Some people will meet up in Paris as well.
Yeah, well, thank you, Peter and Luisa and Michael. Look forward to having more of these conversations with an international group of folks. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Good day.
Bye.